Welcome to Speakeasy Spirits. It is but a short time ago that a mixture of whiskey, vermouth, and bitters came into vogue. Written in 1822, that's how the earliest known recipe for the Manhattan starts. Today, let's take a look at the Manhattan and a couple of variations on it. After the Old Fashioned, the Manhattan is probably the second most well-known and most ordered whiskey cocktail. It's a really simple recipe consisting of a whiskey, usually rye or bourbon, and 1 or 2 vermouths and some bitters. That may sound too simple to really have a lot of room to play with, but depending on what you choose as your whiskey, your vermouth, or your bitters, you can make entirely different cocktails. You'll have a completely different experience from cocktail to cocktail based just on the ingredients you choose. The Manhattan is really a great way to contrast and compare ingredients. If you want to try out a new vermouth, make a couple Manhattans. Make one with your usual vermouth, and then one exactly the same whiskey, the same bitters, but switch out the vermouth, and you'll see it can make a world of difference. Same thing for whiskeys. Keep the vermouth the same, swap out the whiskey, you'll have a new experience. Today we're going to try different combinations of whiskey, vermouth, and bitters, and maybe at the end we'll throw in some extra ingredients and try something really interesting. That original 1882 Manhattan recipe had 3 variations. One listed it with more vermouth than whiskey, one with equal parts whiskey and vermouth, and the other with a splash of orange curacao. That was back then. Today, you're going to find 3 variations that most bars will know. The regular Manhattan is usually going to be a rye or bourbon, a dry vermouth, and bitters. A perfect Manhattan is going to be an equal split between sweet vermouth and dry vermouth, and a sweet Manhattan is going to be just the sweet vermouth. I prefer a perfect Manhattan, so let's start there. We're going to use this Rittenhouse Bottled and Bond Rye, Dolin Blanc, and Antica formula. This is going to be a stirred cocktail, so let's start with a mixing glass with some ice in it. I haven't really talked about ice on this channel, but it is an important ingredient in your cocktails. I make my own ice cubes from water that I run through a Brita filter and then freeze in ice cube trays. Because the ice adds dilution to the cocktails, if you don't like the taste of your water, you're not going to like the taste of your cocktails. I'm not really concerned about making crystal clear ice. I do appreciate it when I see it in a bar, but here in the Speakeasy, I just want the drinks to be cold and tasty. We're going to start our perfect Manhattan with 2 ounces of Rittenhouse Bottled and Bond Rye. I prefer using a rye in my Old Fashions and Manhattans. I like that peppery rye note that it adds. Makes it a little more interesting and complex. But you can absolutely make this with the bourbon of your choice as well. Next, we're going to use 1/2 ounce of this Dolin Blanc vermouth. Now, Blanc is not exactly the same as a dry vermouth. A dry vermouth isn't going to be quite as sweet as this, but this will add a lot of herbal notes and a little bit of sweetness to it. And last, a sweet vermouth. We're going to use Antica formula. Now this is one of my favorite vermouths. I think it really adds some nice herbal notes. It's got just the right level of sweetness. And for our bitters, let's keep it simple with the standard Angostura bitters. 1 or 2 dashes, depending on how you like it. Now we're going to stir this for about 10 seconds, or until the outside of the glass becomes frosty and cold. Now we're going to strain this into a rocks glass using 1 large sphere of ice that I also made here at home using some ice molds I bought on Amazon for a few dollars. For garnish, we're going to use 1 cherry on a skewer. You could also garnish this with a strip of orange peel, but as you can see, I'm out of fresh oranges. There you have the perfect Manhattan. This is definitely a spirit-forward cocktail that really showcases whatever whiskey you use. In here, I'm getting those peppery rye notes. In these proportions, The vermouth is really not covering up any of the flavors of that whiskey. The vermouth just adds those nice herbal notes and brings up the sweetness just enough to make this a really pleasant cocktail. The bitters add a little bit of complexity and some spice notes, but really the whiskey is going to be the star of the show when you make a Manhattan. Before we make our next cocktail, let's talk about vermouth for a moment. Vermouth is made from wine, and like any wine, once you open it, the clock starts ticking. Now that the bottle's been opened and oxygen has been introduced, it's going to start to change its flavor over time. There's a couple things you can do to make your vermouth last longer. First, I try to buy it in these smaller bottles, that way I can use it up before it starts to change. Second, keep it refrigerated. I keep all my vermouths and aromatized wines in a refrigerator. That's going to extend their shelf life a few more months. And third, treat it like you would a wine. If you've opened up a wine, you're usually going to have a pump to pump out the oxygen, or I like to use this wine saver. Now, this is just a can of inert gas. You can spray some down in there. That's going to sit on top, creating a barrier between the oxygen and the wine. That's also going to help keep it fresh. Combine all three, you may get a good 6 to 8 months out of a bottle of vermouth. If you haven't had a Manhattan before, a perfect Manhattan is a great place to start. It's right in the middle. You can decide from here if you like it sweeter or drier and adjust the vermouths accordingly. You could cut back to a 2-to-1 ratio on the sweet to dry, or cut one out entirely and make it much sweeter or much drier, depending on how you like it. I already know I like my Manhattans on the sweeter side. I also really like those herbal notes in the vermouth, so we're going to kick both of those up a notch with this next recipe. Once again, we're starting with a mixing glass filled with ice. This time, let's try it with a bourbon. We're going to use this Evan Williams Bottled in Bond. You may see a trend on this channel. I really like my Bottled in Bond whiskeys. Now we're going to cut this back a little bit and go with 1.5 ounces of bourbon. For our vermouth, we're not going to use vermouth at all. We're going to use Lillet Blanc. Now this is technically very close to a vermouth. It's wine-based and it's got the herbal notes and the sweetness that you'd find typically in a vermouth. We need 1/2 ounce of Lillet. You could definitely use a sweeter red vermouth here as well. We're just trying something new. Now to this we're going to add some Mandarin Napoleon. This is a Mandarin orange liqueur. You could use a dry curacao here as well. This is going to add some orange flavors, a little herbal note, and some more sweetness. Now we need to pick some bitters. Just like we didn't use vermouth for our vermouth, we're not going to use bitters for our bitters. We're going to use an Amaro. Now Amaros are typically a bitter red Italian liqueur. Some of the more well-known Amaros are Campari or Amaro Nonino. In this case, I'm using Pergo. This one's a new one to me. I've tasted it. It's very herbal, and it does have that bitterness we're looking for. So all we really need is 1 bar spoon of this. That takes the place of the bitters. Let's give this a stir. Again, we're serving this in a rocks glass with 1 large cube of ice. Now let's strain this. We'll garnish this with a cherry. And I don't have fresh orange peel, but I do have some candied orange peel. So let's drop that in there as well. And there you have my variation on a Bonaparte Manhattan. With both the Lillet and Amaro in here, it is much more herbal. There's a little minty taste to the finish. This is really refreshing. Right up front, you get that bourbon note. There's some barrel notes and a little bit of cherry. In the mid palate, you really get the orange starting to come through, and then it finishes with that herbal minty note. It's a really nice combination. Now, so far I've made both these Manhattans in rocks glasses with ice. That's because it's really damn hot down here. Normally, this would be served up in a coupe. So let's make one, serve the traditional style. But this is not going to be a traditional Manhattan. We'll start again with a mixing glass and some ice, but this time instead of bourbon or rye, we're going to use my favorite whiskey alternative, Applejack. Once again, this is bottled in bond. This is an apple brandy aged in bourbon barrels, bottled at a really high proof, higher than most brandies, but I use it as a whiskey alternative. So we're going to go with 2 ounces. Now for our vermouth component, we're going to go with Punt Emes. Now this, a lot of people would argue, is also not a vermouth. You're typically going to find it in the same place as the vermouth, but this is just a lot stronger flavors. It really amps up those herbal notes. We're going to go with 1 ounce. For bitters, I always think apple and cherry are a good combination, so we're going to use these Fee Brothers cherry bitters. 2 dashes. Now we're going to stir this. Get it nice and cold. We're really not going to mind any extra dilution. With the Punt Emes, this is going to have plenty of flavor. Now we'll strain this into our coupe. Now you may notice this isn't all the way to the top yet. That's because we have one more ingredient. We are going to top this with sparkling wine. So add just enough to bring it up to the top. And with rye whiskey and a standard sweet vermouth, this would be called a Boothby cocktail. But with the Applejack, I think we're going to call this one the Big Apple Manhattan. But that is definitely the most refreshing of the 3. The Punt Emes hits you right up front with a sweet raisiny note and lots of herbs. The sweetness it's adding really wakes up the Applejack, brings those apple flavors forward. This falls somewhere between a whiskey lover's drink and a fruity cocktail. It's really good, really interesting. On the finish, you get a little bit of those cherry notes. This is a delicious cocktail. The sparkling wine really lightens it up, makes it very easy to drink. I hope I've shown you some of the possibilities there are with a Manhattan. There's so much you can do with just a few simple ingredients. If you have your own favorite Manhattan variation, leave it in the comments below. This channel is quickly growing thanks to you guys. So as always, I hope you liked the video. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.